What is up, everyone, and welcome to the NY Patriot Show. I'm very excited for this episode. This is a topic that I have wanted to cover, probably within the first month or two. I even started this podcast, and I finally found somebody that is able to come on and cover it for at least, a whole episode's worth. So I cannot be happier to finally touch on this topic. And even better, I got Michelle from Michelle's Healing Home and Mario from Symbolic Studies both with me today, who do have their own separate shows. So, Michelle, I will let you go first and let you plug all of your stuff in your show for the people who don't know who you are.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm really excited to be here and talk about this topic. I'm always telling Mario, I really want to expand my network when it comes to talking about these subjects because I have such a passion for it. And so when you asked us, I was like, yes, it's happening. I've been trying to get it, like you said, I've been wanting to talk publicly about this for years. And so here we are now. No better time than right now. My project is called Michelle's Healing Home. I have a weekly podcast that comes out every Tuesday, 4 p.m. Pacific Standard Time called The Healing Home. I'm interviewing all sorts of people, healers, herbalists, you name it. I'm kind of like just going into all the rabbit holes that I'm really interested in. I'm an herbalist. I'm a medicine woman and a homemaker. So that's where my passions lie. That's what a lot of my project is surrounded with. I have a monthly newsletter that comes out on every full moon. It's called my Full Moon Offering newsletter. Yeah, so that just came out just on August 30th. So you can go to michelleshealinghome.com to sign up for that. You can check out my blog there. You can learn about me and what I'm doing. You can contact me through my website or my email, michelleshealinghome@gmail.com, if you want to know anything else about me.
Awesome. Thank you very much. And again, for coming on. And Mario, if you want to plug your show anyway, since you're here as well.
Yeah, sure. So my project is called Symbolic Studies. And generally what I do is I follow the astrology signs as we pass through them and talk about their symbolic value, the mythology that's kind of associated with the signs. I generally talk about a lot of tarot stuff as well. That's what we've done a handful of shows on at this point. We covered the whole entire major arcana. But if people want to find my stuff, it's symbolicstudies.com, or you can check out my YouTube, which is at Symbolic Studies.
Thank you very much, Mario, for joining us and making this happen, too. I appreciate this. And and I also got Teresa with me from the Spiritual Gangsters, my partner in crime, co-host.
What's up?
What's going on?
Not much. How are you?
Very good, very good. And thank you very much for joining us as well.
Of course. I'm excited.
Yeah, I know this. I think, honestly, it's a topic, and this is another reason why I've been excited to cover it. It's really a topic that I don't know much about.
Samesies.
Yeah. I remember I had asked you, and you're like, I don't really know much about this.
You're like, do you know anything about it? I was like, nope. Yeah, but just from what I was quickly looking up and what Michelle was describing before we started recording, it sounds very interesting.
Yes,
so,
yes.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And I also got Lisa joining us. What is up, Lisa? Thank you very much for jumping on.
Absolutely.
And I do know that you actually do know a little bit about the Process Church. You have told me when I told you I was having Mario on, you started rambling some things.
It's like, ask him this, ask him that, ask him
Yeah.
this. Don't forget to ask this. Yeah.
Have you on instead,
Yeah,
so
yeah.
make it easier.
That's great.
So, yeah, that is the panel for this topic. And I guess really, we're done kind of introducing everybody. If anybody wants to check in the show notes, I have every link that Michelle had on her YouTube. I have like 4 or 5 links for all your stuff, Michelle, already, and Mario. I have all their links on the bottom. Definitely go check that out if you enjoyed this episode. And I guess we'll get into it now. I don't know which one of you want to go, who wants to start, how you want to get this going, but the Process Church.
Well, I can get started if you guys want.
Yeah, since you're the one covering it.
Jump in head first, right? Well, okay. First off, the process, like we said, I think it was backstage, but my interest in this group came from researching Charles Manson and that whole mythos. And I've been looking into this stuff for almost a decade now, I'd say, with the Manson stuff. And there's something in the air going on right now where it's wanting to come back up to the surface, I feel like. I think the Manson thing is always going to be a thing for every generation. But I find that as I've been doing this research that it bubbles up every couple of years or every handful of years. And I'm like finding all these new people talking about this subject now, more interest. People are asking me more questions. We're doing a series. We have a second show actually that we didn't announce. It's called Last Thursday. It's on my channel where we're diving into, right now we're in our Summer of Love series. So we're going through the 1960s and kind of just like dissecting it and bringing up points that we've noticed. And a lot of it was inspired by Charles Manson. And so the whole thing with Manson and the process is pretty deep. There's a different opinions on it, whether or not, the mainstream story is that the process church influenced Manson in such a way. And he was this like spiritual guru, hippie cult leader that was mesmerizing and hypnotizing all these people and these women and what have you. And the process church kind of gets like stuck in there as more on this like mystical side of things. But I think there's such a strong, dark underbelly current to this. And the process really did a lot of work to try and get their name out of the Manson story. And so that was what's really interesting to me, is that they worked really hard to kind of disconnect from authors that mentioned them in books. They did not want to be associated with Manson whatsoever. But when you understand what all of these people were doing, there's no way they weren't connected, And I think that it was sensationalized to a point to make it seem like it was more mystical than it really was. But when it really comes down to, it was sex, drugs, and rock and roll, but also like sex trafficking, drug trafficking, weapons trafficking, you name it, man. I mean, it was all going through these channels, and I think the process played a really big role in it in terms of just ritualistic stuff, but the influence of the time, because cults were a big thing, and that's what their main thing was, is that they were kind of an organization based in Scientology. So that's where their roots are. The roots are in Scientology. The couple that started it, they were in Scientologists, and the stories is that they were kicked out of the group. But the main woman, Marianne is her name. She was actually an auditor for Scientology. And I believe it was like in 1963, I think, is when they were both kicked out, her and her husband, Robert de Grimson, who is the man who was, in charge of the process church as well. So they kind of like split off, did their own thing. They started an organization before the process where they were actually doing auditing themselves. And instead of using an E-meter, they used what they called a P-meter. So their whole thing was called processing instead of auditing.
P-scope.
A P-scope, sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah, P-scope was the name of it. So there's a lot of crossover with that kind of stuff. So you guys can chime in whenever you feel too. Like we can just have a back and forth. But yeah, the crossover of Scientology is really interesting, especially also with Charles Manson, because if you get into him, you realize that there's a lot of programming through Scientology that he had in prison, actually, So there's a lot of crossover. There's rumors that there was an E-meter found at the Spawn Ranch when they did raids and stuff like that. So there's a whole bunch of stuff that's connected.
That the e-reader is the thing that when they do, what do they call that in Scientology? Put your hands on the thing and they audit you or something like that.
Yes.
Yeah, for clearing purposes.
Yeah.
What?
And then
Yeah,
there's
and
the electromagnetic surface.
And it costs you money too.
Yeah.
And so you got to make sure you do these things to move up to the next level. But it costs you money.
Oh, man.
One thing I was going to mention real quick, you just did say, Scientology. Something that Lisa had told me that I actually found really interesting. I'm not trying to get like too far ahead in case this was something you're going to bring up, but wasn't there something with Leah Remini? Now, I know she has left Scientology and shits on it, but doesn't she actually, weren't you telling me she still donates to something that's associated with the Process Church?
She has a company, a nonprofit organization that saved the children. I can't remember the exact name of her organization, but one of her most notable donors is the Process Church. And it's like, how are you so anti-Scientology, but you have the process pretty much flipping the whole bill? And and so majority of the people that are still high ranking in the process are pictured with her at some of these donor events.
Interesting. Is it through the name of the Process Church? Because they also now, right, they go by the Best Friends Animal
Yes,
Sanctuary.
I was just going to say that. I was like, but I think she also has nonprofits of like animal organizations who also have their show on Nat Geo.
Oh,
So, yeah.
interesting. Yeah, that's one of the
on.
most wild things about it, where it's like, at least back in the day, just a few years ago, the Best Friends Animal Sanctuary used to acknowledge the fact that their roots are within the Process Church. Like, that was like a publicly known sort of thing. And in my opinion, if you're running any kind of animal shelter or anything, really, why would you even mention that anywhere?
Right.
You know,
Yeah,
in
like,
your
why is that
literature or whatever.
relevant?
Weren't they associated with sacrificing animals?
Yeah,
And
yeah,
so
that's a thing.
it seemed like, what? How are you best friends with animals if y'all are
It's like CPS, you know?
Yeah.
exactly.
Take care of kids, but we
No,
traffic them at
actually-
the same time. It's fine.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but they when they left London, didn't they relocate to Kane, Utah?
Well, they
Is
left.
that-
They left London and then they went to. So they did a couple things actually. They were in London and then they went down to Mexico for a while. Actually,
Yeah, that was Exul,
yeah.
Chetul or something like that.
Something like that. I think you got it.
Xtul, Shtul. Yeah.
I feel like
Yeah.
every major cult somehow gets to Mexico for some reason.
Yep.
Somehow, some way.
Isn't he even Manson? Wasn't Manson at one point had it in his head that he just had to get to Mexico? He was like heading to Mexico for something at one point.
Oh yes, yeah, and he was like up and down the West Coast. You know, obviously a lot of people know breaking parole and all this stuff. You know, just evading everything. Got arrested multiple times. Never seemed to matter. You know, he never got caught for anything, but he was on parole basically the whole time. All these shenanigans were happening, right? But yeah, so they go to Mexico. And they went to Stuhl or Stuhl. You said it. I think you said it
okay.
correctly.
Yeah, it's fine.
Either way,
Yeah.
they're down there, and like the locals didn't take too kindly to this because they're all in their black robes and they're doing their thing and they're like, spitting some satanic kind of like vibes, I would guess. And people, they were not very welcomed. And the story is that a hurricane came through the area and like demolished where they were living. They come to the U.S. and then they go to New Orleans. New Orleans is where they first kind of like got, put their roots down, which we found out some interesting things connected to New Orleans as well. But then from there, San Francisco, and then throughout the U.S. and Canada. Not too sure about the Utah thing, though. You could be right, though. I think
No,
that they
I-
kind of like,
Yeah.
hopped around. It was one of those things. The more people they could get, the better. Really.
They had to stop over and ask the Mormons, how do you do it?
No, that's where I
Got
was
any
like going with
tips?
this because Mormons went down to Mexico. They moved over, didn't want to associate. They became the best friends of the animals.
Yeah, they're big with Mexico. That's why I
Yeah.
mentioned.
And
Just
it
a
was
little side tip on Leah Remini. She's best friends with Jennifer Lopez. Like best friends. Now I don't know what that means. I'm just saying. Fun fact.
Right.
Yeah, and they were in the Caribbean. The Process Church was in the Caribbean. I don't know if it was Puerto Rico, but they were in the Caribbean before they went to Yucatan, didn't they? And they had the whole meditating, and being in Mexico was a line of demarcation further from the process. Like if you weren't there, then you aren't part of, whatever, is from what I understood.
Right. Yeah, well, they have the whole connection too with the dogs. If you've looked into the process, they have this thing with Alaskan dogs, but also German Shepherds.
Yes.
And so there's another animal dog connection. And there's reports of like, there were, dead German Shepherds found. So speculating that there were sacrificed, lots of sacrificial things happening on beaches in California, like in Malibu. The Spiral Staircase, if you're familiar with that house, is tied up in the Manson stuff, and the Process Church, which is basically like a squatter's house. So it was like an abandoned house, and squatters would just come through and they would stay there. And so people traveling through whatever, and the Manson crew, that was their MO, dude. Like they were squatting everywhere. Most houses that they stayed in were abandoned, and they would stay there until they got kicked out. And then they finally found the Spahn Ranch, where they found, George Spahn, and he let them stay there. That's the story, whatever. But I find it interesting that that's kind of basically what they're doing. They're basically just like homeless people, like bouncing around, but they had connections because they had Manson, and I think that he was a heavily connected man. in a lot of ways. So yeah, but the process, Mary Ann herself has an interesting past because she's from Scotland, and before she even got hooked up with Scientology, she was like a high level prostitute, like a high end prostitute for aristocratic people in Scotland. Then found Scientology and kind of worked her way up the ladder. And what we always talk about and what you find when you start researching cults is that sex is a big thing in cults because it's used for control. And so you're working with a woman that was a prostitute. It's like no judgment or whatever, but we all know like the deal with that. And so she's, pretty then open on the sexual realms. So, which is going to then allow her to, assert her power in certain ways or be used to assert power, to be used to lure people in with sex. And then we're dealing with the 1960s, which was basically a sexual revolution. So it all kind of goes together pretty interestingly, in my opinion, when you look at it.
Yeah, and one of the things I wanted to mention too is that the 1960s, there was a lot of activity, right, in the cult world and the occult world. And so my understanding is that, Dave McGowan is a guy who, wrote about a lot of this stuff, but there were a handful of cult groups that were created in the 60s and the 70s that were essentially fronts for other organizations, alphabet agencies, and things like that, right? So whenever you're talking about any of these groups, you just have to kind of wonder, what their connections are in that regard. And then also, too, I don't know if you guys have covered Scientology at all, but L. Ron Hubbard is an interesting character, right? And his occult roots and all the stuff he did with Jack Parsons and the whole Babylon working and all that kind of stuff. Very, very fascinating.
Crowley even told Parsons he's a scumbag.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
He sent him a letter warning him. He says that guy is going to, he's no good. I mean,
Right.
Coming from Crowley. I mean,
Yeah, no, exactly. And Parsons was like his son, essentially, right? So his like magical son.
and then what did he end up doing? He ended up stealing his boat and his wife.
Yeah, exactly. And so there's a handful of well-known, famous people who were associated with the Process Church as well. So I don't know if you guys are familiar with the director John Waters, the filmmaker. He was part of the Process
Really?
Church.
He was?
Yeah. There's actually a documentary that came out maybe 6, 7, 8 years ago, something like that, called Speak of the Devil.
Sympathy for the devil.
Sympathy.
Sympathy, yes, you're right. And so we had that, and it's a good watch, but it's coming from the organization. And so they're going to be, it's kind of sanitized in a way, right? Because it's their perspective and everything else. But John Waters is mentioned. George Clinton is mentioned as well. Genesis P. Orich. I don't know if you guys are familiar with her.
Yes.
Right. So psychic youth and all that kind of stuff. So she was part of the Process Church. And so there's some bands as well that were like Process bands that would actually put like the Process logo like in their artwork and things like that. There's a connection too with like the underground sort of like noise industrial sort of scene as well. Genesis P. Orich is very much in line with all of that. In fact, actually, that's a whole deep dive as well, is just like industrial music, noise music from like the like 80s and stuff, and like their occult
Skinny
connections.
Puppy has mentioned Manson.
Skinny Puppy, yeah, exactly.
In their music. The song Warlock has him sampled all throughout. And they have that song called Spawn Dirge or some song. Or something like that.
Don't they have him
Yeah,
on
that's
radio
weird.
and
As
stuff
soon as
like
you
that?
said like noise and music, I was like, Skinny Puppy, kind of like a noise, industrial music. That's
Yeah,
why.
no, exactly. Yeah, you got it.
Oh, wow.
Yeah,
That was-
well, and go ahead.
No, I forgot what I was going to. There was something I was thinking about before you said that. I totally forgot it now.
Well, the music connection is interesting, and I feel like I'll just bring it up now because I was going to bring up something else, but we can go back to it. But
John Waters. When you're done, I want to go back to John Waters. Real quick.
okay. Well, through the Genesis P. Orich Psychic TV stuff, I actually just came across this, but there's a website called just process.org. Okay. And if you're into this, I recommend going to it. It's just like a running blog. So the story with this blog, though, is that Genesis P. Orich was connected to it while she was still alive, but now it's still run by 3 other people. And they just say on there that, you know, it's just a place for them to air their thoughts and their dirty laundry or something like that. But because I've got some true crime people here, I wanted to know if you guys know who Gigi Jordan is. Have you heard of her?
I've heard of her. I've never listened to any of her stuff, but I've heard how intricate she's involved with all that stuff.
Yes. So, okay, like I said, just learning this. So this is all kind of like new, but long story short, so she basically, she killed her son by like forcibly giving him pills. He was highly autistic. And the story with her is that she was like a millionaire lady, pretty sure from Manhattan. And she claimed that she was being followed and tracked by an omnipresent satanic cult, and that they were basically, through satanic ritual abuse, making her son autistic. And her justification for killing him this way was that she was convinced that if she didn't kill him, that he was going to just go through like a life of suffering. Now, the reason I'm bringing this up is because it's on this process website. And the other reason I'm bringing it up is because there's some kind of link with the process and children. And in one of the books that we owned, which was an awesome book, and if you can find it, they re-released it, so it's like a little bit more affordable, but the original print is really expensive. But what it is, it's just a collection of all the Process Church's magazines. They used to put out magazines back in the day in the 60s. So they had multiple issues. One is
magazines and pamphlets.
Yes,
Back
totally.
in the day, I don't think a lot of people realize that.
Didn't
A lot of folks I've looked into, they put out books.
Well, they used to call the issues, like, they would just call it death, like the death issue, the sex issue, you know, and fear was another one.
I knew fear, yeah.
Yep. And so, what was I going to say?
Sorry.
No, it's okay. In this book, when I was looking through it, every time I'd look through it, I would just notice, I'm like, dude, why do they are always emphasizing children. There's just like collages of photos of children and dogs. And to me, this story here, it just kind of like brings together another tie for me. And then I'm like, why is this on the process.org website? Why are they interested in this specific case? You know what I mean? And the satanic ritual abuse and how deep all that stuff goes, the mind control, the programming, the split personalities that happen when these people go through these sorts of abuses. I really think that the process might have a bigger role to play in these sorts of behaviors than we might understand. But I'll let you go back to the Waters man if you wanted to talk about him. But I just wanted to throw that in to see if you guys had heard of this woman, because I think this happened back in like 2008, the actual killing of her son.
Oh, wow. The only thing with John Waters that I just wanted to mention, I mean, you said he was in the Process Church? Like he was like a member?
Yeah, he's like a proud member. He appears, I believe, in the documentary too that we will just.
Has any of the people here on this, I guess panel, have you seen any of the stuff he's made actually?
I have, yeah. Well, only one or two.
I saw Pink Flamingos. I know that's like old, but I mean his stuff is a little disturbing, kind of, in a sense. Like when I was younger, somebody gave me the VHS tape. That's how old this is, And
Right.
I was like, 17 or 18, and I had already moved out and had my own place. And I was like, yo, what the fuck was this? I don't even think I watched the whole thing. It was like the chicken part was enough when they got into the chickens and stuff. But like I would put it on like when I would have like people over my place just randomly and put it on just to get people's reactions. So like I thought it was funny, but if you really like kind of like look at like the stuff he filmed, like that shit is bizarre. I think.
Oh yeah.
Especially
Absolutely.
flamingos. I mean, there is a scene where it looks like they're literally probably screwing, if not at least naked on each other. I mean, there's live chickens being used. Like, fuck these chickens, and it's wild. It's wild.
Right. Oh yeah. No, exactly.
Some lady sitting in a kid's pen waiting for the Eggman. It's what the. It's really
Well, even the other one I mentioned, another famous processian, I guess you can say, is Genesis Peorage, right? And his whole entire thing was that he was born a man, and he ended up having this like huge kind of like epic love affair thing with this woman, and they thought it would be a good idea to start looking like each other. So he actually went through the transgender process a long time ago, before it became like really, kind of popular now and everything else, before it was like understood or promoted or anything like that. And so for the last handful of years of his life, he walked around as a woman, and he was a chaos magician. That was one of his whole entire things, is that he's very closely in line with the chaos magic lineage, right? And he wanted to look like his partner. And so that was the whole entire goal, was to look closer and closer and closer to his partner. And so it's a whole entire thing. It's very interesting, but he talks about the philosophy behind it, and it's this divine androgyne sort of concept, very much a Baphomet sort of concept, sort of thing. And so a handful of the members that were part of the Process Church were into extreme forms of art, extreme philosophies, chaos magic, things like that.
That's really interesting that you're mentioning that, and then I'll get off of John Waters and we'll go back. But it's just like, because if this guy's a proud member, maybe he kind of represents a little bit of like the type of weirdness you'll get from this place. That's why I'm kind of stuck on this. But you mentioning this other stuff with Andrew being Andrew, whatever, and sex change and this and that.
Mm-hmm.
Does Desire, I think, was the name. Did you ever see Hairspray?
I did, yeah.
Hairspray. Now I think the lady is actually a dude. Desire, that's in that.
Oh yeah, sure.
John Waters started that person off in his movies. I'm pretty sure Hairspray is one of his movies too. Like he got it is so disgusting. At the end of Pink Flamingos, that person who plays Desire literally takes a dog, craps right there in the street, and picks it up and puts it right in its mouth. No cut, nothing.
Yeah, that's what I remember too.
That's how screwed up of a person this is.
Right. Well, speaking of screwed up people, so we had the release of their compilation of the magazines, right? Fear, Sex. What was the other one? Death.
Yeah.
And so we were looking through it. It had just gotten released. This was how many years ago? Like
when we bought it?
Yeah.
Probably at least 9 years ago.
Right.
We got it. Yeah.
Maybe 9-10 years ago, whenever it was released. And I'm just casually looking through it. It's very interesting. There's a lot of collage work, kind of like early magazines and zines. And there's actually, I believe it's called the cut-up method or the cutting method, where this is actually an occult technique that a lot of chaos magicians have adopted, is using kind of cut-up material, putting them together, creating new landscapes and whatever, new meaning and all of that. And so there's a lot of that in there. There's games and there's weird artwork and weird photography and things like that. And I'm flipping through. I can't remember exactly which issue it was. And I just see this chaotic, mad-looking face. And it's Jimmy Savile. It's a young Jimmy Savile. And he has his bug eyes, and he looks completely nuts and everything else. And I'm like, holy shit. I'm like, he's in here? Why is he in here? And literally, the first question, this was after everybody around the world found out that he's a pedophile and everything else. But obviously the interview was way before this was like public information. And they ask him, the first question is, are you a moral person? And I'm not going to say it verbatim, I can't remember, but paraphrasing, he essentially says something along the lines of, during the day I'm moral, but at night is when the wolves come out and chaos, wreaks havoc on the world or whatever. He says something along those lines.
I've heard him say some weird shit like that before, I think on a documentary I watched.
So that's in the book. It's so wild that this is the thing after knowing what he has been accused of and all that kind of stuff.
When you hear him say that, you're like, well, that guy was just coming out and telling you already.
Yeah.
Like when you put two and two together, you're like, the guy's already telling you he's a fucking weirdo.
Yeah. Hey, wait, I have a question. Do you guys know if the Process Church is at all connected to like the Satanic Church or like Anton LaVey?
I don't know, like officially. I don't know.
Right.
But I would suspect that they
knew
each other.
Right. Now,
I
only asked because I was listening to another podcast yesterday, and they were talking about something with children, and it reminded me of like your connection, Michelle, with like the children and whatnot. Very interesting.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say that one of their things was that they believed in like 4 supreme gods or deities or whatever.
Yeah.
And one of them is Satan. So it's Jehovah, Lucifer, Satan, and Christ, essentially. So, but they had a presence in the Bay Area, and so obviously Church of Satan, Bay Area as well. Spinoff with the Temple of Set, also Bay Area. Lots of, I mean, honestly, San Francisco is really has been a hotbed for occultism for a very, very long time. So there, I wouldn't be surprised if there's some crossover there. Yeah, but I haven't read anything. And
yeah, like officially or anything. Yeah.
Right.
Gotcha.
I
Okay.
think they tried to distance themselves for, I think, sometime after the 70s because they wanted to qualify for tax exemption. And that's when they started wearing the robes and started calling themselves spirituality or basing their stuff on spirituality. But going back to Peoria, that's like classic, reconciliation of the opposites. And then with Seville, it's the whole, compulsion analysis, where they don't want you, they want you to release all your compulsions. And once you release all your compulsions, then the spirituality will surface or something like that. And I think that's where the whole kid thing comes into play, at least with some of the blogs that I've read. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that makes total sense. And I mean, you can't avoid the fact that they were established in London too. So then you have Jimmy Savile and that whole thing. And I'm not sure if he was knighted, but I think, isn't that one of his things?
He was, yeah.
So,
Yeah.
and we all anyone who's swirling in these circles knows how deep that stuff goes and how actually prevalent the pedophilia is prevalent everywhere. But it seems like in London and in the church and the Catholic Church specifically, it's like really deep there. Yeah. And we saw some massive like protest art and stuff when we were actually in London, like kind of with that, and because the Pope was coming through, and it was like coincidental that was actually happening, and he was like going to be paraded through the city or whatever, and there was tons of just like basically protest art against that, and talking about they had like little stories of people that were abused in the church, and they were like plastered on sides of buildings and all that stuff. It was actually quite a sight to see, to be honest.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
But in London, the process had a coffee shop. It was like a late night coffee shop called the Satan's Cavern. And so they're just like, what the heck? I mean, it's hidden in plain sight, just like all these other things are. And they preached like millennialism, which is basically, Armageddon type stuff. That was their whole philosophy, that there was going to be some end times, kind of similar with Manson. They say that was his whole thing, which I'm up for. I'm up for that not being 100% true. I'm up for that being like probably a fabrication from Helter Skelter prosecution, Vincent Bugliosi kind of trying to, again, push that really crazy cult leader thing. Because there's definitely like switching stories on that when you read multiple books. Like you have people who are really debunking stuff, like Neil Sanders is a really great author. Now is the Only Thing That's Real. This is a great book, and he is the guy who actually brought to my attention that this whole process thing might be played up to a certain extent to make it seem like it was more of a satanic thing, but when it was really just more like we talked about in the beginning, just about drug trafficking and sex trafficking and prostitution and stuff, and that it was way more tied into the CIA and the FBI than we're really like led to believe, and they want us to just think that it was some like crazy sex cult that was just like hippied out on LSD all the time, which they were to a certain extent, but I don't think that's all it was. I think a lot of it's just a big cover-up for a lot of the things we're talking about right now.
And you're interviewing Neil.
I am going to interview Neil.
Way.
Yeah.
Wow.
Oh my God. I feel like a little girl on Christmas Day when he emailed me back and he said yes. I was like, oh my God, yes. So that will be really exciting. I remember I got this book back in 2000. I think it was 17 when it came out, and I read it in like 2 days because I was just like, oh my God, this is so great. So for anyone out there who hasn't read it, he's a great writer, and he brings up points that no one else had at that time brought to my attention, and that's what got me even on a deeper rabbit hole with the process. Because also, you guys may have you may know, but like there's also some connections, they say, to the smiley face killer, which I know you guys have talked about on this show. And there's that whole kind of tie, which kind of also makes me feel just like strengthens the ties with like the animal sanctuary and the fact that they're still an active group, but they're hidden in these ways where even if you go on the animal best friends animal sanctuary website, they say like we were started by like a rough and tumble group of friends or whatever. Like that's, you know, if you can read between the lines, it's like rough and tumble, and then you know that the process or whatever is kind of hooked up with this. But anyway, I just find that it's interesting with the smiley face thing and that being a potential. Anyway, no,
that's exactly right. With the actual the techno music, or however the electronic, what do you call it? Industrial music. The whole tie with the smiley face killers, and then kind of the tie back in with the process church and how they kind of interweave. And then the Mansons. I mean, it's like a continuation, but just an evolving of the marrying of the two.
I'm actually I'm unaware of the musical connection with the smiley face stuff. It's not really my rabbit hole or anything I've spent too much time on. But what's that connection? That's interesting.
There's a couple of really good episodes from Ramsey that he talks about some of the industrial music being tied in,
especially with Nine Inch Nails. I think it was.
Yes, exactly. And
video.
We did an episode with JJ Vance, and we were talking about how some of these bands you want to look into, and that sometimes they're often playing in the areas that an event will have happened or will happen eventually.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So there's,
That's actually something I had predicted, not predicted, but I threw up as a high possibility. When I first was even podcasting and did the Smiling Face Killers stuff, I said to me, believe it or not, I would think either traveling bar bands or carnies. Because they're always on the move. You can, and if you got other people involved, oh yeah, so-and-so was with me at 12 o'clock when that happened. No way. No way could that have happened. It's easy, I think.
And testimonies of people that are in the bar scene will say something was suspicious or something was up and it was this band and whatever. And so,
wow.
There's all of that.
Very interesting. So one thing I just wanted to mention real quick too is that, so the process itself is literally a reference to the auditing clearing process that Scientology developed. And actually, my personal opinion is that from what I've read and what I understand is that in the right hands, actually, some of these techniques are effective. But if you're being handled and if people are, basically using it against your will for various things and they're documenting everything, then obviously it's not a good thing. But I think some of the basic techniques actually might be helpful, but I'm not speaking about that from like firsthand experience or whatever. But one of the things that Scientology does is they have you go through the auditing process and they're documenting everything. So they're documenting everything about your life essentially. So the longer you're in Scientology, the more they know about you and everything that makes you click, everything that gets you triggered, your deepest, darkest memories. They go through all of the corridors of your mind. And that's what the whole entire thing is. At least that's my understanding. And they're ranking you on this scale of consciousness, right? And so I can't even remember. We watched a documentary where it was literally L. Ron Hubbard back in the day talking about the ranking system, right? And so they have all of these different levels. And as you were saying earlier, it's like you have to pay to go through these different sort of levels and to get tested again and to go through these different courses and everything else. And so my understanding, I think at some point, it's pretty much like, or at least maybe this is even a hunch, but Manson may have tested really high. Yes. Basically, that his awareness of self, I think that's part of it. Your awareness of self and kind of your awareness of the world and things like that. It's ranked on this consciousness sort of scale. And so it makes sense that they would rank members because the people who rank really high, they're going to use you for different things, right? So they're going to be like, oh, well, this guy is very charismatic. He could talk to so-and-so, or he can run this organization, or he could do this thing for us or whatever. And so you're kind of basically creating a hierarchy, right, with all of your members. And some people are going to go higher much quicker. Some are going to take a long time. Some people are going to test really high immediately, things like that. But when we were doing this research, one of the things that kind of occurred to me is how similar this is, in a way, kind of, to like Freemasonry or something, where they have the different levels and different degrees of everything. So I kind of wonder, actually, if some of these occult groups who maybe have like a longer history and a stronger foundation, if they're kind of doing something similar where they're actually ranking you based on consciousness, and then that's going to dictate how they use you in the future, essentially. And so I think that the process, right? I mean, they must have been doing something similar. Maybe it was more half-baked or whatever. But the whole entire thing is just to kind of create this order with your members.
I definitely think secret societies, like you even said, with Freemasons, there's like orders that you won't get in unless somebody asks you. So it's like how
Right.
do you not know if you're being asked because of just who you are, politically, publicly, it could be for multiple reasons. I mean, even in the OTO, I know after the fourth degree, you have to be asked to move up. And there's a shit ton more degrees than there is before you get to that. So, I mean, you're going to be handpicked at that point, and there could be many reasons why.
Yeah, and I mean, this is a great subject. I'm glad you brought this up because it does. We can go into even how their hierarchy worked, in the sense that it's Marianne and Robert de Grimson. They were known as the Omega. They were the highest. So their nickname was the Omega, and then it went down from there. It was masters, and then priests, and then I believe the prophets, and then messengers. So it definitely was like a totally ranked system. And I just imagine, like we were talking about with the magazines and the pamphlets, they had these messengers going out and they were literally soliciting on the streets, definitely in San Francisco. They were recruiting, they're handing out their magazines, they're handing out their pamphlets, come to the process church, come to the headquarters, what have you. They're having meetings, they're doing tea and coffee and all this kind of stuff. And so it's always very interesting to see how this stuff works, because it's like a physical hierarchy, but it's a psychological hierarchy as well. So you're keeping people at these certain levels, and maybe they'll move up, maybe if they process better next time or something. But I think there's like this carrot that's dangled in front of all these people, which keeps them in the groups too.
It sounds a lot like how Nexium worked. Like you always had to be continually doing this like inner work, and then you get your scarf colors and like move up in these ranks. It sounds so similar. The process, right? Always
totally.
Processing.
And you had to turn over all your money too, right? You had to take a vow of poverty and celibacy, unless they allowed you into the groups where everybody was having sex at that point. Yeah.
You got
Only
to orgy level
Only
status.
Yeah.
You got to keep your money.
Yeah.
Yeah, and
Too
Manson
funny.
worked very similarly. When you hear about the accounts of new girls or guys coming to the family, they took their ID. He would take their IDs, and then if they had money or they had an inheritance or they had family members that had money, somehow that was channeled into the Spawn Ranch or buying a vehicle or whatever they were doing. Worked very similarly. And a lot of people who have looked into Manson probably know this detail, but it always creeps me out. And it's just like, well, he did this for a reason. But one of the things he would do to initiate the girls is that a new girl would come and he would take them off and have sex with them and then tell them, I'm your daddy. Like, I'm your father. Think of me as your father. So doing that thing, that is a psychological break.
During the act.
During the act of sex. So it's like, that is such a heavy psychological break that happens. And the thing too, with a lot of these people that end up joining these types of groups, and it's not all of them, but most of them come from, a broken home, or they don't have a good relationship with their father or their mother, which, has all sorts of repercussions. So he has all these children, basically, essentially, because most of them weren't over 18. Most of them were in the range of 12 to about, seems like to me like 12 to 16 was like a very common range for the family. And so a lot of them were either kicked out of their house, or they didn't have a good family relationship, or they voluntarily left because they were being beckoned by bands like the Mamas and the Papas and all these other people telling them to come to San Francisco and wear flowers in their hair. And that's where he recruited most of his people. And I find that the process probably worked very closely in these same sort of realms, most definitely. And then you have like the love bombing that would happen if we go back to like the animal sacrifices, maybe killing animals in front of somebody and, making them bond with them, but then killing them. I think there was a lot of the same sort of behaviors happening in all of these sorts of groups, really.
Yeah. And one of the things I was going to mention is the whole dog thing. And so I think, if I'm not mistaken, the Best Friends Animal Sanctuary logo is actually a dog. It's like a stylized dog icon.
It is.
Right. And so the dog is associated with the underworld, and it kind of always has been. And so it's an underworld creature. So just like Anubis from Egypt, Anubis is the guardian of the underworld. And actually, there's a lot of information, there's a lot of research being done. I don't know if you guys have gone down these rabbit holes, but there's this whole idea that a lot of Egyptian symbolism actually developed here in the West and then was exported further east. And what we consider to be the old world is actually the new world.
Correct.
And that this is actually technically, if you look at it that way, the old world. And so it's really interesting. There's some people who've come out and they've said that this dog from Mexico, Jolo, is actually Anubis. That when you look at the Anubis artwork, it looks very much like this dog, and this dog was
mohawk and everything.
and the ears and just the way its head is shaped and everything else. That this is actually where we modeled Anubis after, and that this dog is also very much associated with the underworld. And so I just think that's kind of a curious sort of thing. And then also, too, dogs being sacrificed is also a thing. And this is a heavy mercurial sort of thing as well. And so my understanding is that some dogs used to be sacrificed at the crossroads, and that this was in honor of Mercury. And I believe there's a version of Mercury, which he's Mercury, so he's very mercurial. You know, he wears lots of different masks. He's a shapeshifter sort of thing. But dog symbolism does relate to Mercury, as does lunar symbolism. And you're always going to see two dogs on the moon card as well. Or in the Crowley deck, the Thoth version, you're going to see two Anubis figures with two smaller dogs underneath them. And actually, those figures, the Anubis figures, are holding the glyph of Mercury as well. So I think that makes a lot of sense for a magical order or group, you know, associating themselves with chaos. Is Mercury has long been associated with magic, right? Hermes, Thoth, you know. So I just thought that was kind of all worth mentioning, just like the dog symbolism and how maybe it plays a part in all this stuff. Last thing I'll say, go ahead.
I was going to say, I mean, just from our tarot series, I think we showed proof enough that there's enough dogs on tarot cards that could be something, you know?
Right, yeah, exactly.
Also, too, St. Christopher is the patron saint of travelers. You're talking about crossroads. And he's said to have had the head of a dog.
Oh, there you go. Perfect. Yeah, exactly. Exactly right.
Yeah, I think Hecate supposedly had dogs sacrificed to her at crossroads.
That's what I was going to say. Yeah, 100%. So Hecate is sometimes known as Lady of the Crossroads. And then Hermes Mercury is known as Lord of the Crossroads. And I've heard that when you hear the bark of a dog, it's kind of like it's the sound of Hecate, essentially. That there's kind of no difference between the sound of a dog barking and her essence or her presence or something along those lines.
There's also the Cerberus who guarded the underworld too, the three-headed dog.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that's all, you know, just very interesting stuff.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but wasn't this also around the same with Charlie Manson and everything? Son of Sam was going on, and over there they were actually sacrificing German shepherds.
Yo, I was going to say, what is up with them being German shepherds?
Yeah,
constantly?
and the German shepherd was symbolic. The actual breed of dog was symbolic to the Process Church. I remember.
If it wasn't for a German shepherd dog, we wouldn't have Gilgo Beach going on.
That's true.
German shepherd dog is what found all that stuff. And constantly German shepherds with shit.
And that's what the Border Patrol used. Well, until they use the Belgian Malinois, but they use German shepherds. Police would use German shepherds. I mean, they're extremely intelligent by all means, but why use German shepherds of all breeds to sacrifice? I didn't know if that was symbolic of some sort, but I remember it being mentioned over and over.
Yeah, it's a good question. And one of the things I've thought about with this one is just when you look at the symbolism that the Process Church uses, you know, it's like a pseudo swastika. They're kind of like Black Sun sort of kind of stuff going on. Right. And so I just wonder if there's more of a connection to some of the stuff that Mario has been tapping into with the North Star being like actually a portal out of here, maybe them understanding that mythology and actually practicing it, and then through their symbology showing it, but for only people that were to know, and maybe the German Shepherd being some sort of homage to all this stuff,
Yes, yes.
or some
Well,
way for them.
they had said that they thought that it was a front for Nazism and
Ah.
fascism, and that if you look at the symbolism, it looks like the swastika spinning, right, like into the swirl, and then you just image it or something like that, and then hence the German Shepherd.
You know, just real quick, something that you had mentioned is actually something I have thought about. Might be reasons for multiple suicides with cults. Is what you're saying with that leaving through a portal. I think maybe the news or the way that people might understand it, they think, oh, they were trying to catch Hail Bop or whatever comment. No, these people were occultists, and they were trying to exactly what you said, the Black Sun, some sort of portal. I do think that might actually be something kind of like an underlying thread with some, suicide cults. I think it's a little bit more than the way we're told. I think there's actual occultism behind it, and they think that they can actually almost like OA start jumping.
Ah.
Mm-hmm.
I
Yeah.
believe people do. And listen, I'm not saying it's possible, maybe, but I mean, I do think some people might actually multiple suicides is them thinking they're doing it.
Right. Yeah, exactly. I was just going to mention the fact that even we've talked about this before, I think briefly, but if you look at the Kabbalistic tree of life, the Sephiroth that leads to the other side, if you will, which has been referred to as the Tunnel of Set or the Tree of Death, the Klipothic tree, it's Doth, and sometimes it's there on the middle path, sometimes it's not. But the illusion is that it's always present, I guess, and that Sephiroth is always associated with the North as well. And so this is where my research is going towards, is just there's a lot of black magicians, dark occult groups that make a big thing about the northern sky. And so my personal opinion is I think that there were probably 3 major symbolic ages. I think we live currently in the solar age or the solar tradition, which came after the lunar tradition, which came after the stellar tradition, which essentially is the polar tradition. And actually, you can see this in the tarot with the star card, moon card, and sun card. They're showing you the 3 major symbolic traditions through the ages. And so I think that a lot of these black magical groups that tap into northern symbolism, they're basically just going to the most ancient symbolic tradition, essentially, which is polar or stellar, which makes a big thing about the northern sky, the North Star, Ursa Major and Minor, all that kind of stuff.
I think a lot of that black sun or eclipse looking stuff, or even, certain symbolism we see with German shit. You say that word too many times, you get, strikes on YouTube. So. Or demonetized at the very least. But I do think that has a lot to do with actual, like, real magic. And even to the point to where I think it even goes back to, to get on the eyeball series again, but even the 2 different, you have a bright little circle and you got a little dim one in the back of your eye. I think those are the 2 poles and polarity in a sense. And, I think they're showing you some real deep occulted symbology actually with stuff like that. Or like eclipse symbolism, the cup in Twin Peaks, the constant white cup with the black coffee in it. I think it's all showing you like crossing the abyss. That's what
a great point.
Right.
Because that, if just from my experience, again, experiences that I have had before, I have, to me, gone somewhere that is not here anymore. I always get, it's almost this glowing eclipse that when it fills up constantly, fills up fully with white, it just explodes and I'm somewhere else. But it looks like an eclipse before all that happens. So, like, after I had these experiences, I started seeing this shit, and just been like, oh, wait, like, I've seen that. And, is it a commonality that's shared with people? I don't know, maybe, but I have seen it in so many other things now that was already a cult that, my opinion, from my experience, that's what I think it's symbolizing, is like you actually about to go somewhere else. Which is why I think these people are thinking they're going somewhere else permanently.
Or they think they're going and coming
Yeah,
back.
yes, and they just never make it back, which is why I don't fuck with it, because I'm not guaranteed I'm going to come back. And unfortunately, I'm still too tied to this world that I'm not ready to give it up.
Also, isn't it interesting that Charles Manson, too, just thinking about the swastika, but he had the X on his forehead. But did they change it into a swastika?
They did.
Right.
Yeah.
And so, anyways, I think that there's always been a perpetual sort of long-term sort of campaign against the swastika. And you go to other places around the world, and it's a very positive symbol. I personally think it's one of the most holistic symbols around out there, and I think it does relate to the northern sky. But I think because of its power and because of its holistic sort of nature, I think that's why the powers that be would prefer that. Basically, it's considered to be a negative sort of symbol. So the Process Church symbol. There's actually two variations of the Process Church logo as well. There's one that kind of looks a little bit, there's a few curves in there, but it does very much kind of still look like the swastika. And then there's another version where it's just like hard lines. It's bars, basically. But it looks like a swastika without the end arms, essentially. And so either version looks very, very similar to it. And then, of course, they tied it to Charles Manson as well. So only spooky bad people here in the West use the swastika. That's what they want us to believe.
Yeah,
But
and
wasn't-
just
go
no,
ahead. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Oh, just something that I wanted to bring up, like with the connection to Charles Manson. When we were a long time ago researching the Musk family, like Elon Musk's family, there's a connection between Mae Musk, his mom, and Charles Manson, and apparently they were great friends, supposedly. And she used to like visit him in prison, gifted the prison like all these TVs to help with mind control of prisoners, all this sort of stuff. Yeah. I don't know. Weird. But then I just wonder too if the Process Church and Scientology kind of has a link and a similarity to like Raelianism, that like alien religion, which I'm pretty sure that's what Elon Musk really believes. If not him, at least his ex-wife, what's her name? Grimes. She is like a professed Raelian. So I don't know. It's just kind of like all links together somehow, I feel.
Right. That is interesting. And then I just have to mention too, just the fact that Twitter is now X, right? So we're going back to the X sort of thing, and the occult symbolism of X is very, very, very deep. There's a lot to be said about that, just in general. But the Raelian thing, right? It's a I don't know if you mentioned this, but it's the Star of David, the 6-pointed star, and a swastika combined, right? Which is very interesting.
That's what Kanye West posted when was that symbol. So I even found it even weirder,
And really, what's the difference too, by the way, for some of these groups, there is essentially no difference between what we might refer to as an extraterrestrial and a demonic entity, or a being that is crossing over from the other side that we're opening up a gateway for. Yeah, exactly.
It wasn't until y'all that you started talking it in this way. I always kept them separated, like peas and carrots. I always said that the demonic was a spiritual, supernatural of some sort, and that the aliens were biological, and that it was one or the other. It was either a spiritual entity of some sort and interdimensional, and then the actual physicality of the biology of the presence of an extraterrestrial. And so when y'all explained it, I was like, okay, well, I could see the marrying. But before y'all explained it, I was always peas and carrots, like they're separate. They're always separate, just because of the biological interpretation filter that I viewed things through. But yeah.
Right. No, once it's pointed out, and once you kind of have the eyes to see it, it starts making a lot of sense for a lot of different reasons. And so there's some work that I've read by this fellow named Kenneth Grant, and he really gets into a lot of this stuff, and he continues to bridge the gap between what these things actually are. And so there are occult groups that are summoning, again, what we might refer to as extraterrestrials, other people might refer to as demons or spirits or whatever. But a lot of the symbolism, a lot of the crossover is very much there. There's a lot of overlapping themes between, trying to channel, or actually space travel. My personal opinion is I don't think you can actually get out of here. That's my personal opinion. I don't think you can physically get out of here, but you can astrally get out of here. But you're going to return, And so I think that's one of the things that's, the wool that's kind of been pulled over our eyes is we've convinced the world in large part starting in the 60s with the moon landing. You know, when they show you a person landing on the moon, they're actually, you don't know it, but they're giving you a cosmological framework. They're saying that you can actually go to the moon. They're saying that you can actually go to the stars. You can go to these other planets. You can get on a spaceship and take off. What was that?
And it does exist.
Right, and it does exist. Right, 100%. Meanwhile, occultists, they're traveling to the stars. They're going to different planets and whatever, but it's on an astral level. Right.
That's
and
why I even mentioned that thing with the comet. Like when you look how occultism can be played, milk of the stars, every man and woman is a star. Could you not see why people could use outer space as symbolism for their occult stories?
Why they even call it the astral projection, the astral plane. Like it's star related. You know, like all our space words are either spiritual or water related, which is spiritual too. So.
Exactly. The water's above. Yeah, no, 100%. It's so interesting once you realize that, you know, or even just the idea you watch a sci-fi movie, you know, these are cosmological presentations as well, the same way, you know, the moon landing was. And so you get into a ship, right, which obviously if you're going to sail the seven seas, you're going to be on a boat or a ship. And then also we associate this weightlessness with water when you're swimming around in water. And then what are you presented in these movies is that you're floating around in outer space. You know, so exactly to your point, the water oceanic sort of symbolism overlaps entirely with space travel.
Right. And it's all the same vocabulary for birth as well. You know?
Yes.
Exactly. Yep.
Weird. Yeah.
Which one of the things that I always think of when you're bringing up like the eclipse and what you see when you've taken a substance or whatever, wherever you're going and you're seeing that eclipse vision, you bringing up birth reminds me of when we got to see the total lunary or total solar eclipse here in it was in Oregon back in 2017. The first thought I had when I was able to see it in its full form, I was like, "Whoa, this is like seeing a baby being birthed." That was my way of like comparing it because I had helped my friend in a home birth. And after that experience, the only thing that compares to that was watching the eclipse like do its total thing. And so I really do think that, you know, we're all hitting on things that are very much just on point with what's really going on here. You know,
they don't call it crowning for nothing, right?
Right? Yes, I know, right?
I was even going to say, like, going by like the way they talk about like the firmament again, to get back to the eyeball, going from like you have like the aqueous humor and the vitreous humor. To me, I could see that going from the waters here to the gel-like firmament in the skies, which is when you start going farther back into the eyeball.
Yeah. Well, and then the other thing it makes me think of, going back to Manson for a second, is that he was not obsessed, but he really got excited when one of his girls got pregnant. That was a thing, you know. There were babies, there were children happening. He was impregnating people. People within the family were impregnating each other, and he would like be just, you know, just like any father or any person that would be excited about a child, but he got really excited about it. And they had multiple home births, you know, that were they were birthing babies all together. And I mean, there's something about it when I'm reading this stuff. I'm like, wow, you know, there's something really precious about that. But then I think about these children and what they were brought into. I'm like, oh man, that's like not precious at all, though. It was this very interesting kind of thing psychologically and emotionally for me to read that and being like, whoa, it's beautiful that all these women came together to help another woman bring this baby into the world, but what were they actually really, you know, bringing them into, and what happened to these children? You know, you don't really hear too much about the history of these children or what happened after. A lot of times if they got arrested, they were on the road, the children be taken into custody, foster homes and stuff, and they would always end up getting the children back somehow, which is always just like kind of puzzling to me, you know.
So weird. That's why I brought up Anton LaVey earlier, because that was sort of hitting on the same theme, Michelle, is like he would get so pumped and like want all these kids and stuff to try to produce like the bride of Satan, basically, and then like put his children through all these rituals. There's like 7 rituals at least to prepare and defile them enough to like marry Satan. And it would be like a great honor for him to have his daughter be the one chosen.
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah, I don't think I knew that part of it. with the Church of Satan. I know a little bit more about the Temple of Set, and in comparison, I don't know. This is just what I've heard over the years, is that Anton LaVey was very much like, it's almost like a stepping stone to like darker occult groups in a lot of ways, you know? So that's why he was rubbing elbows with a lot of famous people and things like that. And that, I know that's actually one of the reasons why Aquino left and started doing the Temple of Set, because it wasn't serious enough for him.
Right.
And so he ended up going
I don't
deeper.
know.
and-
Sounds pretty serious to me.
Did one of his daughters or say something that they went to the Church of Satan?
I was going to say that.
This
His
isn't even.
daughter said that.
Yeah.
But it was,
What did the daughter say?
it was dramatized atheism, and that she went to the Temple of Set because she says in the Church of Satan, you're actually not really worshiping anything besides yourself.
Right.
She
I
said there's
don't
no
know.
entity.
Yeah.
So
I'll send all you guys what I listened to.
That it wasn't hardcore enough. I think that it wasn't hardcore enough. Yeah.
Maybe.
Exactly. I think for a lot of people, that'd be plenty hardcore, you know.
Good.
But for some of these other folks, I think they maybe wanted, you know, I don't even know, just a deeper understanding of things. And that's why it's actually an older sort of thing, Set. You know, when you get into Setian symbolism, I actually interviewed a guy, and he's a proud Setian, but he believed that Set actually can be used for good and not necessarily evil purposes. But Set is considered like an ancient god that existed before a lot of newer gods, basically. So it kind of reminds me of, actually, it's very, very similar, the way Lovecraft describes some of his deities as being like really ancient ones, and that they actually came before a lot of other gods.
The
So people who
gods, is that what it was called? The pre-Adamic gods?
Oh, you know, I don't know if I've heard that exactly, but that makes sense. Yeah, exactly. More primordial, basically, in nature. You know, so someone who's a Setian, as an example, they look at, actually, it's fascinating to me. I think about this all the time, and I think there's something to be said about it. It kind of gets back into my symbolic traditions sort of thing. But that the sun, the moon, Jupiter, Mars, Mercury, you know, these gods are new gods. This is a newer class. The sun is part of a newer class of deity. Set is part of an ancient class of deity. And so the Temple of Set is going even further back than some other groups. So that's my understanding of things, at least.
All right. Where were we with the Process Church before that? I forgot.
Well, one of the other things I think of with the process and Manson, so it's on the books. Some people might know this story or have heard of it, but you know, it's worth saying anyway. But he was supposedly, Manson, visited by two members of the Process Church in jail. All right, so I see that you've heard this, right?
Yeah.
And what's interesting about that is that, okay, no one supposedly knows what they talked about or whatever, but we can use our imaginations. But shortly after he was visited by them in prison, the Process published one of his articles in their Death magazine, the issue of the Death issue. So they gave him a spot in their magazine. And to me, that's almost like a payoff. Like, okay, you keep your mouth shut. We'll put your article in our magazine, and that's it. And then there's really no other, there's no other talk from Manson about the process. He never mentions it. Not many people really ask him about it, because I think not a lot of people even really knew about it. Because at the end of the day, I just think that they're basically kind of like one of the OG groups of mind control and, beginning this whole trafficking of humans and weird sexual experimentation, weird sex cults and rituals and abuse. I think that they're just really, really intertwined in all this stuff that is still going on to this day, and unfortunately probably will continue because of just what is going on and the way that this realm is. I think that, with all the evils, but with all the beauty, it's like it's balanced in some way. And so that's what I always kind of try and remind myself of, because when you start going down these rabbit holes, as you all know, it's like it can get dark really quick, and then you can get really grim, and it can be really negative and be like, oh my God, how can this happen? But it's like there's this weird thing that you have to remind yourself of, like, it almost has to happen for this place to exist and for us to be able to even function here. And that's what I always come back to with the process, is like, whoa, there's like so much of a deeper agenda with it that we might not even fully understand or be able to, because we're not even able to like grasp how deep it all goes. And I'm sure we'd all be pretty appalled if we knew like actually how deep it goes and how many people are connected to it. That we hear these names spattered throughout these books that we research or websites we find, but how many people who are celebrity status are really involved in it? I would believe that there's a lot more than we know.
Yeah, for sure.
Oh, I would think that. I mean, now you said that now Scientology also visited. I could be wrong. Didn't they also try to, or maybe did visit Manson also? People from Scientology.
I don't know 100%, but I know that he had contacts with like, actually, he had contact with a sociologist that he was paired with in prison at one point. And I wanted to bring this book up for people who haven't read it. So Lynette Fromm was one of the members of the family. This is her book. It's called Reflection. I just recently finished this book. It was recommended by a few Manson channels that I listened to. And this is basically her account of meeting Manson from the beginning. Like, it was like her and two other girls that were just like hanging with Manson in the mid 60s. Well, it was 67 when he when he first got out. He met Lynette Fromm first, so he was his first girl that he like brought into the fold. This book is her account of all the things that they did, so it's kind of comes from like an innocent place almost. She's just like, she has a lot of stories about, oh, he was so gentle and this and that and what have you. And then it goes through all the phases of everything. But what she doesn't do is get too deep in anything. But if people are interested in this information, I recommend reading it, because if you can read between the lines, like we're able to with a lot of this stuff, she brings up so many things where it's pretty obvious that he was either met with someone and something happened to him. They either did like a Manchurian Candidate thing on him where they flipped a switch and he changed. And there's a particular meeting that they all have, with a sociologist that he was involved with at McNeil Island prison when he was there. And they went up to Washington, and his parole officer specifically sent them there. Like, he was contacted by the sociologist, and the parole officer said, no, you guys should go up there. I think it would be good for Charles. So they take a trip up to Washington. They see this guy. They have conversation or whatever. They end up leaving his house. And Lynette talks about how he kind of like freaks out. Like, he has some sort of flip in him. They have this van that they're traveling in, and he ends up like stopping the van near a mountainside, and he takes the pink slip out of the glove compartment, and he's like, we're going to leave this for whoever finds the van. We're going to go to the mountain. They start hiking up this mountain. And she says specifically that there was, like, Charlie was a different person during this time. Something happened. She noticed a shift in him. And she says that it was the first time I started seeing behaviors in him that you started to see, like, in the courtroom, when he started losing his shit, like, towards the end of this whole whatever you want to call it, debacle. And I found that really interesting. And then he eventually snaps out of it. But it's like, well, what happened there? What did the sociologist know? What were his triggers that he knew? What did she not write about that she didn't even notice that happened at the house? So it's like stuff like that that's in this book that is very telling, but she only goes so far because she either didn't know or didn't notice it, or she has a lawyer who's like, you can't say that. And we're not going to put it in there. But I recommend it in that sense, because there's some good stuff in there for sure. But there's things like that reminded me of the Scientology stuff that is talked about, that he was kind of like connected with in prison, and that he was selected as one of the prisoners that had to wear headphones at night sometimes. And he talks about having transmissions through headphones. And we know that, prisoners are kind of like, unfortunately, looked at as lab rats. I think we all are in general, but when you're in prison, it's like, unfortunately, you're in this space where you don't have many options. And if they're going to choose you and they're going to put you in a special room that's a different color than everyone else's and do stuff, that's what happens. And he was one of these people, I think, that was selected and kind of pinpointed for whatever reason, whether he was groomed from birth or not, I don't know. But that's definitely, sewn throughout this whole story with him, for sure.
Yeah. So you think he might have been MK Ultra himself?
I think so. Yeah, I definitely think so. and he talks about, I mean, he was in and out of juvenile facilities. He talks about from an early age, he learned how to perform sodomy on men and what to do and how, like, literally graphic details of like learning how to spit right in his hand and what to do and, like spit to lubricate and do this stuff. And I've read some of this stuff where I'm like, whoa, dude, it's like kind of crazy. But in some of the interviews, that's the thing about Manson that's so intriguing to me, is that he has this like brilliant mind. Sometimes he says stuff in interviews or whatever, and I'm like, wow, he actually gets it. But then there's like this flip side of him, and that's usually what happens to sometimes the most brilliant people are like the most whacked out, it's kind of how it works. And I think that he was probably programmed or like noticed from a young age with that. And the sodomy stuff is like pretty well known that that's one of the main ways to program someone or to break them to such a degree where you can start inserting programming. So I think that was done to him, but then I think he was also doing it to other people as well.
Wasn't he also for a brief stint at Boys Town?
Mm-hmm. Yes,
Which
he was.
I think was, I could be incorrect, but I think might have actually was in like Mooseheart, right? Like, I think it was actually on property that the Loyal Order of the Mooses owned.
That I don't know, but I do know he was in Boys Town, and I know he escaped somehow. He always ended up escaping these places. He would escape, and then he would be arrested and thrown back in. And a lot of things which is interesting. He was always attached to like Grand Theft Auto. He was always like stealing cars, and then that theme continues through his whole story, because then you have the cars that they would steal and then turn into dune buggies, and then the dune buggy thing was like a huge thing for them. They had a lot of people around them, a lot of bikers who knew how to work on engines and bikes and create things. So a lot of the, like, towards the end of their stint together, a lot of it was, dealing with stolen vehicles and all that kind of stuff. So I don't know.
Right.
Something that you had mentioned earlier, like really early on in the episode, and it's just something that, I wanted to maybe see if you knew a little bit more about. You had mentioned that, I think, pamphlets or whatever. Were they like, do you know of like magazines or pamphlets or things, publications that they did quite oftenly? Like, did they do stuff like that and have stuff for like members or stuff that they'd use to try to reach out to the community?
The main thing I know about is their magazine series that they did.
Yeah,
That's the main thing that I've read about and researched. And there's plenty of photos. You can sometimes find them online, but most of those photos that I've seen of it was in the main book we were talking about, that compilation book, of them standing out and having these magazine issues. And it was all like self-produced or self-published, by the church itself at their headquarters in San Francisco and London, is where most of this propaganda stuff was coming out. And that to me is, I mean, there's truth in there, but a lot of times, like, I've read a few of the speeches from Robert de Grimson, and it's kind of like, wait, what? What are you even saying? It's not very clear. And I think there's something to that kind of thing. There's like this psychobabble that happens with this stuff, that people just get sucked in. They don't even know what they're reading. And I think a lot of their stuff was like that. I
think literature is used for that a lot. Psychobabble, or almost like reading being MK Ultra, reading something to an extent.
Yes.
And like, again, I mentioned cults, but like, I didn't, you have Jehovah's Witnesses, they got the Watchtower. You have so many things that you think about that it could be looked at as a little weird or cultish. They always got their little pamphlets and the little things to hand out to you.
Yeah, totally. I think one of their big things was literally aesthetics.
Yeah.
And so when you look through these magazines, there's like a aesthetic quality to it that is very intriguing. And so if you're kind of like a wayward soul, if you're young, if you had just moved to San Francisco from like the Midwest because all of your favorite bands and this is just like what people are doing right now, yeah, of course, I could totally see why a lot of these kids would get sucked up into this. And part of their aesthetics, what was their costuming, wearing the robes and everything else. So if people haven't seen what they looked like, I definitely would encourage people just to give it a Google image and look up the Process Church and their appearance and everything else. And I think that the theatrical side of things is what really kind of sucked in a lot of people. I could see why a lot of people would find that appealing. But speaking of Manson, just real quick, I wanted to mention that I think this is an interesting thread. I don't know if this is kind of a legitimate sort of thing or not, but as she was talking about their exodus to the desert,
Oh, yeah.
Right. So they wanted to go to the desert. He thought that they were going to avoid some sort of race war. And that supposedly he picked this up through the White Album, the Beatles' White Album, right? And that Helter Skelter was alluding to this race war sort of thing, and that they were going to live in the desert, and that they were going to kind of come out, and that they were going to like repopulate things, or just kind of like at least just survive on their own. Is that the main thing, or what?
That's the main thing. But, Neil Sanders, in that book I showed earlier, he kind of is debunking that and has some accounts of Manson in prison with interviews talking about, like, I was never really talking about a race war, but
Right.
it is the mainstream narrative, though. Yes.
But they did go to the desert too, as well, right?
They did, yes.
And so, anyways, and from her readings, she was mentioning that they went out and they were ill prepared, and that they literally went to a part of the desert that was like no man's land, and that it kind of got perilous at one point. And this is from Lynette Fromm, right?
Yeah.
And so, anyways, I'm not sure if this is actually the thing or not, but it just kind of got me thinking that traversing the desert in the Western occult world is symbolic of crossing the abyss. And this is crossing the threshold. This is actually going to the other side, if you will. And so it reminds me very much of the oh man, you know the Sephiroths better than I do in the Tree of Life, but they're the top two in the middle path. It's symbolic of going, when you go from one to the other. I think it's probably Kether to whatever the middle one is. That's symbolic of crossing the abyss, and that's actually associated with Gimel, which is the camel, and the camel was looked at as being kind of like the ark or the ship of desert people crossing the desert. So there is this kind of like parallel that I kind of see a little bit of him going out to the desert. And if they're maybe fabricating the story, if they're encoding it with occult symbolism that way, but going to the desert and crossing the desert for a long time has been symbolically likened to crossing the abyss to the other side, crossing over to the other side, if you will. And so I don't know. I'm just kind of, spitballing here.
To me, that actually makes sense to me in a way, especially going back to the eyeball again. I have said myself, I had questioned if the race war was literally just your pupil in the sclera, if you want to go back to occultism. And when we had covered the eye, the cornea, which is, the outside part of your eye, does look like desert floor underneath. And like I've even questioned, is your eye also will suck in oxygen? So is that where you get ox, a lot of weird stuff with that. The ox is tilling the ground so you can start growing stuff. But I do wonder if somehow, the race war, the pupil and the sclera, we got to get to the desert. That's the part that's above all that shit. It's just very weird if you start looking at it even in the occult eyeball sense.
Nice. Yeah, that's interesting. So the desert having always been a place of transformation, I guess, is kind of one of the larger themes with all of that. So his kind of like, he was inspired to go, right? It almost seemed like a spiritual quest or something for him.
Yeah, that's how it's described. And he loved it out there. And that's when, so if you're looking into the Manson stuff, the Barker Ranch episode, like the Barker Ranch period of time is kind of what we're talking about. They also went to Death Valley at some point, but Barker Ranch was actually a house that was owned by one of the members of the family. Well, it was owned by the parent of one of the girls who was, in the family. And it was just kind of abandoned. They didn't use it. Again, there's that squatter thing. Like the parents weren't using this cabin in the middle of the freaking desert that was literally off the paths. They talk about how hard it was to get up there, like going over big boulders, and roads are washed out and everything else. And it's on, it was basically located between LA and Vegas somewhere in that area of the desert is where they were spending most of their time. But yeah, talking a lot about, that's where the bottomless pit myth comes from. And apparently Manson was actually referring, he had a area that he found at one point, because they used to go out and scout for water out there because they didn't bring water or whatever it was. And he's scouting for water, and he found this pit that he called the Devil's Hole. And he said there was literally a river that he found that was running north. the direction of north, and he was like, how does the river run north out here? And so he called that like the Devil's Hole, and that's where the whole bottomless pit thing actually was originated from. And then it just got totally, once it came to court and everything, you know, they took that and ran with it and was like, okay, they're going to go to this bottomless pit and go in and this and that and whatever. There was talk, though, from Lynette Fromm's book. She talks about how they were listening to the Beatles a lot, and when the White Album came out, it was a big deal for all of them, and they were hearing it, and it was Sexy Sadie, and then you have, you know, all these things. And Blackbird was like apparently their key to the race war that was going to happen and whatever. But there is stuff that I do believe that they were influenced by the Beatles. I just think everything was just like bumped up to be fabricated into something that was a little bit more wackadoo than it actually was, you know, because of the time, you know, Beatles they were huge. So anything that came out, everybody was paying attention, right?
Wasn't there a reference that?
Sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I mean, the White Album and Blackbird, again, you got black and white right there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wasn't there a reference to MK Ultra and the Beatles as well? In that there were the writers of certain songs were scientists of psychotherapy or something like that, if I remember correctly. I don't know.
my whole thing, I don't know if this is what you're getting at, but I don't believe personally. This is we had a whole Beatles episode on our last Thursday show for the Summer Love series. I don't think that they wrote their own music, and so they didn't write their own music. They were definitely connected with alphabet agencies and organizations like Tavistock Institute and things like that. And so they were a whole entire construct band. And so a lot of people have done good work, and they basically are like, they're poking holes in the whole entire official narrative. You know, even just the musicianship of like the records versus what they were performing live. It's like very clear that it's actually not the same musician. So there's a number of studio musicians who have come out and said, oh yeah, I drummed on like 20 different Beatles, you know, songs and things like that. So it was a cream of the crop sort of operation. And one of the big tells for me with that is just how I'm still not over this. She's been hearing about this for like months now, but the whole entire Beatles catalog, going from their early career to their late career and seeing the transition from what they looked like early on, wearing the suits and the mop top thing and everything else, black and white television, all the way to them, you know, performing on top of a building for Let It Be or whatever. It was only 7 years. They released like 12 albums in 7 years. That's like impossible for that quality of music and everything else. And so it's because they had ghost writers and, you know, all that kind of stuff. Is that what you're maybe referring to? Something along those lines?
No, and that's kind of what I had read or people had alluded to, was that the music was written obviously by somebody else, but the people that were writing the music were actually of some sort of mind control experimentation and so forth. And they had infiltrated not only the Beatles, but other bands that were propped up and pushed, especially in the 60s.
Oh, so, yeah, 100%. Yeah, exactly, yeah. For sure. So. Just while I have the mic, I guess, real quick. So Charles Manson, I think it's possible, because I think that this has happened numerous times. It happened in the Beatles. The original Paul McCartney is not the Paul McCartney we know today. You know, he got switched out. And what the story is behind that, I've heard several variations on it. Mike Williams is a guy who does a lot of Beatles research, and so he probably has you know, new information about that. But I am convinced that there was a switch that happened, whether it was necessary, you know, the show must go on sort of thing, or something else, nefarious or whatever. It did happen, in my opinion. I think it's possible that Charles Manson, over the years, because they would roll him out before he died. I remember they would roll him out every 2, 3, or 4 years for some headline, you know, for some news clip thing or something like that. And when we were looking one night at all of these images of Charles Manson, especially after, you know, the murders or whatever, it looks to me like there may have been maybe 1 or 2 or 3 different Charles Mansons, you know, that he actually became a personality character, essentially. And I think once your storyline gets to be a certain level, it makes sense that you would actually perhaps just keep the storyline going regardless of what happens to the actual man. You know, you maybe make someone get surgeries, perhaps
yeah.
against their will or whatever, to make them look even more similar to who they're trying to emulate. And so I think that that's a possibility. I don't have a lot of hard evidence of that, but I could see it being the case for sure.
Yeah.
Wasn't also some of foundations of, I don't know if it was Helter Skelter or Charles Manson or the process, but they were wanting to unite the whole reconciliation of opposites, and that the way I understood it is that they believed that the way that they could prevent the eschaton from happening is if they could reconcile Jesus and Satan within themselves, or within together, or something or another of sorts. So I don't know if that was Helter
Interesting.
Skelter, or if that was because they had asked Charles Manson once, and they said something, and he's like, I have Satan and Jesus inside of me, or I am both, or something like that in one of his famous interviews. As well as he said he was a reincarnation of Robert Morris, who is Robert de Grimson. So
Oh.
yeah.
Yeah, and then Robert de Grimson has he very much has the Christ, look.
Yes, very
going
much
on
so.
as well.
Very much so. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, Lisa, I'm just curious, what's your interest in all of this stuff, and what your research and everything else? So it seems like you've been down a lot of different rabbit holes.
I'll admit, I don't know if it was Geraldo or Sally Jesse Raphael, but Manson was on one of those talk shows back in the day. And it was, it was obviously, it was like a big to-do. They had the family on, or they had the people that were associated with him on. And so when I always become fascinated with the murders of Tate and LaBianca murders, because, it was something like that. And then, of course, my mom saying, oh, my God, he's of the devil. And I'm like, that's the perfect thing to go down, because that's not the thing that my mom wants me to do. So I'm going to do that. And so I always had a fascination with, like, serial killers, and then kind of like, why did this happen? And then the fascination with Manson, how he legitimately didn't kill anybody. He just convinced people to kill. And then going into high school, hearing about MK Ultra, and then just kind of diving into it. And then with the Process Church, hearing the association with Manson, with Sirhan, with the roots that they had with the celebrities, especially in London. It just, I don't know, it was just always so fascinating. The more you dug, the more you're like, wow, like this is some pretty big stuff. But it wasn't until they started talking about the Mexican thing, or the Yucatan thing, that I was like, and I agree with you. I'm of that belief that I do believe that the Mayan and Aztec religions are a lot older than what people believe, and that a majority of, such as the serpent cult, I think y'all have talked about that, comes from this area. And I believe I read something that there were tablets of the serpent cult that originated in Mexico at Alexandria. So that would predate Egyptian mythology. So yeah, that's kind of the whole tie-in together.
Nice. Awesome. Very cool. The other thing, too, that we've kind of decoded a little bit, and I don't know if this is reaching here or not, but Charles Manson, I've always found his last name to be very interesting, right? Manson. And I'm like, Charles Manson, and I'm like, Charles Manson, char, and I'm like, that reminds me of something that's being burnt, right? Even like the Holocaust is a burnt offering, and you start decoding things like, I don't know, the wands in the tarot, you need fuel in order for something to actually catch on fire, right? And so to me, he seems like one of these guys where he's been rolled out to be like a perpetual sort of scapegoat, the same way Hitler has kind of been rolled out to be a similar sort of thing. And so the idea is that I feel like for culture creation purposes and propaganda purposes and everything else, that you always want to have external enemies and internal enemies. And it's better if you control those enemies. It's better if you fabricate them, right? So you can control the narrative and everything else. And so to me, char, there was like a burned sort of thing with that. And then man, son as well. I'm like, well, the son of man, right? It reminds me very much of like kind of like a Christ-like symbol or something like that, how he was sacrificed, right, on the cross. And then he has that cross on his head, or the swastika or whatever it got turned into. And so it just makes me wonder, too, if there's something kind of going on there, maybe with his name encoding sort of a deeper aspect of everything. Because who knows what his real name is, With all these people, it's just kind of like, who knows how what the name at birth. We don't know. So Charles Manson, and then you have Marilyn Manson that adopted that. So it's a combination of like Marilyn Monroe and then Manson and everything else. So I don't know. I think that there's perhaps something to be said there just with his name. I'm not sure. I feel like I had more threads with that when we talked about it a while back, but that's the gist of it.
I mean, I feel like you hit on a lot of them though, because I think it's a really interesting thought because he was like a major sacrifice. Look at what happened to him. It's kind of like he was used and abused and spit out, and then he was used and abused until the day he died. I mean, when did he die? I don't know. Did he really die in 2017? Who knows? It's just an interesting, very interesting.
17 also. So I mean, I still think that's a very occulted number in itself.
We just had the Burning Man festival. You're talking about charred man.
Oh yeah, there you go.
Yeah.
Right.
Exactly.
The burning effigy at the festival, and interesting tie back to the Musk family. So Elon Musk and his first wife lost a child, and his ex-wife Justine goes to Burning Man and does a ritual to honor their lost son every year at Burning Man.
Whoa, really?
Mm-hmm.
Gotcha. Interesting.
Yeah, weird.
It is weird.
The Manson, that's really actually piqued my interest. I think that's a good point.
Yeah, I didn't think of that before.
Something there. Even with, I mean, you're talking about him being like, sacrificed, or the sacrificial lamb of the story. I mean, the son, I mean, even if you look at it a different way, like with Kabbalah, Tiferet, you have the son, and the child is a symbol for that, or childlike. And it's just, the man, the child, it's like, almost like the conquered child again, the crown, the child. Like, I don't know, there's so many things, man and son. Even in like the OTO Gnostic Mass, I am a man among men. There's a difference with man and men. I even think with the letters and the value and like, what even letters can equate to, and, occultism. Yeah. So I do think, looking at his name like that, yeah, for sure, I do think there's a play off some sort of occultism with that name. So at that point, is it even real? Is it even his birth name?
100%. Exactly. So you just mentioned the crowned and conquering child. So the crowned child, we mentioned earlier, you crown, right? You come into this world head first. Not unlike Aries. Aries is associated with the head. Aries is known for those powerful horns. It's the beginning of the astrological year, right? So we come into the astrological year head first, right? So he's known as like the celestial host for the zodiac wheel, essentially, right? And Christ was sacrificed during Aries season, right? And so a lot of Aries season symbolism actually has to do with the nature of sacrifice. And if I'm not mistaken, this is when Passover happens, when you're sacrificing your firstborn child, if I'm not mistaken, which is referred to as the first fruit. And so there's a lot of stuff going on here. At least when I see things like this, I can't not think of, the sign that it could be associated with. And so there's lots of Aries symbolism with this sacrificial sort of thing.
And that was even the thing I was going to say, even where the son of the child fits on that sphere, Jesus would go there. So, I mean, again, going back to something, sacrificial lamb. So, who knows?
Totally. Yeah, for sure.
And then you can even go back to UFO stuff and go, lamb again, with Lamb and Crowley and looking like an alien.
Right.
Who knows what all this lamb and sacrificial shit really means?
No, absolutely. For sure.
Was there anything else you wanted to touch on? I didn't realize we've already gone like an hour and 40 minutes. So, I mean, I don't know if there was anything that you wanted to touch on that you thought was important.
I feel like I went through most of my notes that I had for everything. And I think you guys were great. This was awesome to ping everything off of you guys, and is really fun. And I feel like, how I brought up that woman, what's her name? Gigi Jordan. Now that I've tapped into her, dude, I'm like, damn, there's so much more. And I've always known that about this whole situation, but I just feel like there's going to be more that surface across this story, and then process.org. And on that website, they actually also have you can go in like on your regular browser, but then they also have like a dark web browser. So then I'm like, what's there? I don't want to know. I kind of don't want to know. I don't really play in those realms. But anyway, on the dark web, I wouldn't even know the first thing, but you know what I mean? Like, that's the kind of like energies we're working with. So, Damn, I'm just grateful to have been able to talk about this stuff with you guys, to bounce stuff off, to learn more, yeah, just like my curiosity with this is just constantly going. So I'm appreciative of your time and being here with you guys. It's really awesome.
No,
And
that
I
was
hope some of the stuff that was brought up, like, brought some more clarity for you guys, and brings more sparks to you and makes you want to jump into it too, because it's really interesting and there's so much here, and I just think there's so much that's relevant to our time today and what's going on, and the things that are also being exposed for us now. It's like all of a sudden all this child trafficking stuff is coming out, and the pedophile stuff is like now being put on blast through movies that are in major theaters now. So you have to wonder that there's like, they're always telling us something, but they only tell you so much. And so this kind of stuff, knowing these channels of things like the Process Church can kind of help other people to dive into research a little bit deeper and understand it for themselves a little bit more, if they want to anyway.
Oh, thank you.
Nice.
It's a great comment.
He was my first super chat, and he's like, "Oh man, I'm sorry." So, I didn't mean to screw you all up there, but that was hilarious. I had to. Thank you, Dang. I appreciate that, and for sure, thank you. I mean, I didn't know much about this stuff at all. So between you, Mario, and the stuff that Lisa knew, I mean, this was great for me. This was all new for me. And again, this is why I always ask Teresa to pop on, because like she brought random shit.
That's what I do.
Like, oh, something. It's wild.
It's just my brain.
Yeah, that's why I got Teresa here for that stuff. Always pulls out some good gems. I thought that was a really good talk. I really had a great chat with all of us here. I was really super excited, and the show was better than I even thought it was going to be. So I thank you all for jumping in. Michelle, would you like to plug your show again real quick to let everybody know?
Oh, sure. Thanks. The Healing Home every Tuesday, 4 p.m. Pacific Standard Time on my YouTube channel, which is Michelle's Healing Home. You can check me out there. michelleshealinghome.com is my website for my blog, my newsletter, anything else that might be coming through. We're actually in the process of developing an online store, which is really exciting. I haven't had one in a while. I do everything now. All my orders are through email, but once we have the online store, it'll be really cool. But the offerings, the Full Moon Offering newsletter is the best way to keep in touch with me and to know what I have in stock and the products I'm making. And I always share all my recipes too. That's like one of my main things is I love to make things and share them with people. But I also, one of my main MOs is just helping people to know that they can make this stuff too. And so I always love to share recipes because some people like to buy it. Some people want to try and make it. So that's the whole thing. So just check me out, michelleshealinghome.com for everything.
Yes, and I got all of your stuff in the bottom. So we don't drag this out real, make this ending forever. Mario from Symbolic Studies, his links are in the bottom as well. And Teresa from Spiritual Gangsters, her links for all of her stuff and her link tree is all in the bottom. Also, in case you don't know who they are, go check their stuff out. And Lisa, thank you very much for jumping on again. And I'd seriously love to thank all the people who jumped in on the chat as well. That's why I go live. I love seeing all the stuff, all the info added. Again, like I've said numerous times, if you're going to go watch a live, even if it's already old, you're coming back to it, check out the chat because we have a lot of good info besides what the guest is saying dropped in the chat. It's almost a whole other show in there in itself. So go check that stuff out. And thank you all for bringing gems to drop as well. I appreciate it. And I look forward to seeing a lot of yous. And that is the end of another NY Patriot show. And until the next one, everybody be well. Later.